Welcome to the fifth and final plenary of our conference together, Science and Religious Education in Divided Societies. My name is Ari Kelman. I teach in the Grad School of Education at Stanford University, well on the West Coast. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this morning's panel. I have fantastic panelists who I have asked to introduce themselves, as they can introduce themselves far better than I can, reading a canned preface. And they are Sybrina, Atwaters, Michael Reiss, Rachel Pear, and Anila Asghar. Well, my names were out of order. They are sitting in the appropriate order. When they come take the mic, they'll give their own introductions of their own selves. What we're going to do this morning is start with a little conversation along the lines of the conversations that we had on Friday and Saturday. Thought that'd be a good way of warming things up. The panel has three. I'll give a little preface to that, though. The title of the panel has three key terms: science, religious education, and divided societies. No disrespect to the conjunctions. And I don't think I need to say a whole lot about why this topic is important at this moment in history. It bears directly on questions about what we consider to be truth, and who we trust and why we trust them. The first two terms, religion and science, have been in relationship for as long as both have existed, as incidentally have diverse societies. Astronomers, shamans, midwives, prophets, and scholars have all dabbled in expressions of both and experimented with ways in which they could inform one another. Historically, they have both collaborated and competed at different times, and there are loads of examples of both of those. Whatever their history, religion and science are divergent epistemological frameworks, and their sometimes tense relationship urges us regularly to ask how we come to know what we know about the worlds in which we live. What kinds of data do we find credible? How did we get to where we are? What do we do now, and where do we think it's going? And by what logics do we establish methods or measures of credibility and reliability? And for a room like this, one of the key questions, obviously, is how do we transmit both what we know and how we come to know it to others? In this way, the relationship between science and religion also pushes us to consider what kinds of knowledge is permissible in different contexts, and which different kinds of contexts encourage different ways of knowing. And in this way, it bears directly on the third key term of our panel, which is diverse societies. Different people from different life circumstances have different ways in which they know and encounter and experience the world. Each in their way, religion and science are human attempts to systematize that knowing. And so the question of religion and science education in diverse societies seems sort of very kind of the moment right now. And to share some of these different perspectives, first I'm going to turn it over to you all to warm up in a conversation, and then to our panelists. On your chairs, you have a handout that is led by two fairly lengthy sections, one from Genesis and one from the origin of the species, two of the core texts in the ongoing conversation between religion and science. And at the top are the questions. So take a minute or two, read over the texts, digest them a little bit, and then turn to your neighbors, and you'll have 5 or 10 minutes to discuss some of the questions as you see fit. Hate as I do to interrupt active and productive conversations, we have an opportunity now to enrich those conversations in hearing from our panelists in order, at the end of which we'll have a chance to again come back together as a group with a little question and answer. So I turn the podium over to Sybrina.
Good morning. Okay, just the engineer in me was like the decibel comparison was not working out. One of me, amplified mic, all of you, so I figured I would try it again. I am glad to be able to join you all today, especially around today's topic, so I'm excited about having a part in the conversation, but more importantly, kind of hearing where the conversation goes, particularly with this group. I think it could be an interesting dialogue. I'm normally on the other side with a different group of scholars around the conversation, so this should be fun for me. I was asked to introduce myself, but most people who know me know I'm not really great at the rule following thing, and I feel I've been around a little while that you may know me, so I'm going to say my bio's out there. You can find me. And if you need reference and criteria that I might be able to speak to this, then, just try me a little test if legitimation is important to you. Just trust your board. They would not even invited me if I couldn't say just a little something. So we're gonna do a little trust around here, if that's okay. And I'll just say the screen, name, affiliation, and we can keep moving if that's okay with everyone else. All right, let's do it. So, through the generous funding of John Templeton Foundation, the Association of Theological Schools launched a study called Engaging Science in Seminaries, and they commissioned a few research scholars, including myself, in hopes of establishing a baseline of science engagement in ATS Protestant member schools. The study targeted a purposeful sample of institutional leaders at 30 different ATS institutions within the United States and Canada, and sought to gather data through the perceptions, knowledge, and experiences of key campus informants by analyzing how seminaries engage in science. So I'll start with a disclaimer that I will not delve deeply into the concepts of religion, science, and diverse societies, communities, or divided communities. I'm going to focus more on process. For me, process is significant in this work of intersectionality because most of the time, if we don't get a process that's amicable to then the integration and conversation and the work, then regardless of how deep we become in understanding the concepts in our separate spheres, that becomes impeded by our lack of significant process. So this data is going to share a little bit about the climate, the quality, the advantages and the barriers that's already occurring around, particularly from perspective of Protestant schools, and then talk a little bit about process that I hope then will join with my colleagues' conversation, and at the end we'll come back together and discuss it more fully. The data comes out of a combined total of 1,682 interview minutes. And the interviews was transcribed and then incorporated into the DEUCE, which is a qualitative coding analysis tool systems. So names and all of that is confidential and moved out. So you probably have no idea who these people are and then every idea who they are at the same time. So what the data revealed is that 4 main categories helps us understand the process around science engagement within ATS member schools. One category was how science is ranked among current issues relevant to seminary preparation, how significant science is to understanding care of life among seminarians, and how relevant are scientific knowledge gaps to the theological education. Further engagement of science and theological education included an assessment of the quality of existing science engagement on ATS campuses, and some areas of concern was how is science integrated into theological and religious courses? What sources are used and available? And what embedded theological claims are within these scientific courses or interdisciplinary courses? Lastly, this study illuminated that there are advantages and barriers to the integration of science in seminaries, and often they are flip sides of each other. So, what did our informants tell us about the current climate? 90% of responders expressed that science is among the top 3 issues that they believe are relevant to clergy preparedness and consequently to theological education in the current climate. The other 2 that are probably familiar for each of us is social justice, issues of racism, sexism, sexual identity, and self-care. The top reason given for science being a significant issue for theological education can be found in the words of Sam Richard. We live in a time when natural science, social science, engineering, and technology are among the primal shapers of our civilization. Asghar adds, science and technology are essential parts of our lives in North America, so much so that we don't even really grasp it consciously. Philip affirms, I think I have to rank science fairly high for a couple of reasons, in that it touches every area of our life. Who I am as a human being, what is my destiny, what does it mean for me to live, what does it mean for me to die, and all those questions are at least part both theological and scientific questions. Overall, respondents believe that there's a welcoming and positive attitude towards science on their campus, and then at the same time, very little engagement occurring. Over 86% stated that they did not believe any area of science would be off limits. Interesting, however, they provided a shared care for life thematic framework for how they assess the relationship between science and theological education. They identified various areas, disciplines of science that named are most relevant for incorporation in theological education because they attended to care of life. And so many of us are familiar with those, the behavioral science and environmental sciences. Those have been a little easier, and moving a little bit more into the hard science of physics and neurosciences, as well as digital technology. Although digital technology is kind of the one that they see the least engagement around digital technological theories, not just the use of technology in the classroom. Asghar stated, Christians have tended to react or engage particular positions like on the creation of the universe or the origins of life, similar to the exercise we just did, more recently. Unfortunately, climate change, the mind, neuroscience, genetics, and those things are topics themselves, but with very little appreciation for how science is important, determinative, or shaping in our thinking and being. Seminaries have responded to issues regarding care of life by increasingly implementing particular science disciplines into their program. 64% of interviewees identify evolution and creation care among the top issues of scientific concern and engagement at seminary. 36% identify digital technology as scientific areas because of the role of technology and shaping how people relate, communicate, and function in modern society. Henrietta states, digital technology and how this affects people's persons, their bodies, their relationships, and their mental process, well, that was what I ranked as number one. I ranked digital technological theories higher than decline in enrollment. The biggest issue is a profound gap, says Mark, a faculty at a Canadian seminary, in which we have a generation that is both technologically and scientifically informed, but we have a church in a theological world that has largely treated these as irrelevant, focusing on spirituality, focusing on other issues. I think that this gap is probably the bigger issue for seminaries. So, what type of science is occurring, since we realize that there is some science already being engaged in our theological education? One, as we discussed, that there are particular areas of science that are being incorporated into seminary educations. Respondents were confident that places like pastoral care courses employed psychology in some form. Other courses dedicated some aspect of the course to social scientific methods or sociological theories. For example, Mary shares, I would say on the whole, we do a much better job of integrating social sciences, psychology, sociology, critical theory, than the natural sciences. She points out how one theoretical framework may be applied within multiple courses. Mary continues, Professor B in the theology department uses race theory, critical theory in his courses. Kind of all his courses, really, including a course specifically on race, but also his course on Christology and courses he teaches on the art in the body. Mark, a former physicist, said, for the most part, most of my colleagues would think they're doing some engagement with science by referencing one of the following: either scientific evidence for something in their discipline, particularly in biblical studies, or maybe climate change is evidence for why the Israelites moved into the Levant. They think that that's engagement with science. In terms of pastoral people, they think that engagement in science is making reference to the DSM, the diagnostic psychological texts, and using those categories to talk about people with mental illness. That would be their understanding of integration. What I would counter with is that that's not engagement with science. That's actually or not explaining why the science world may may have concord or discord, or may reinforce or challenge theological concepts. It's just facts that are used, and they are used to talk about already standing theological ideas. In our core curriculum, Roger says, we have a triad of courses where we have one of the major doctoral paired with a major ethical theme. The first of the courses that the triad is the doctrine of God and environmental stewardship. Students talk about the doctrine of God as creator, and then they talk about creation care. Questions of environmental science will be brought to bear there. I don't know if it involves anything that an environmental scientist would regard as cutting-edge scientific inquiry, but it's an attempt to put the findings of environmental science into lively conversation with Christian understanding of God as creator and the Christian responsibility to care for God's creation. And while social and behavioral sciences were the top sciences reported by the key informants interviewed, most environmental and medical science was also highlighted as increasingly being engaged on seminary courses. The next question became, well, then how are they engaged? A lot of faculty, that don't really help y'all, huh? A lot of faculty use guest speakers, things like digital resources that they are citing and incorporating in their work, and blended modern resources. And what I mean by that is that there are a few scholars who were a little more innovative, so they felt, in their incorporation of science in their seminaries. Henrietta describes the field trip model. She's a Christian educator professor. On occasion takes her students to the Center for Brain Imagery to talk about the neurological makeup of the brain and to actually have student volunteers to have their brain imaged. They discuss the development of the brain in education and how certain ways of teaching certain pedagogies might be more effective neurologically than others. Interestingly, for 43% of the respondents, a good scientific resource, however, was defined as a resource that were theologically receptive. And theologically receptive resources are scientific resources by scholars with both scientific and theological backgrounds, or resources that explore issues scientifically as well as theologically without anti-discipline jargon. So as I stated at the beginning, there are advantages and disadvantages. One surprise was that the informants found faculty to be the key gatekeepers. So not administration, not funding. While all of that was significant, they found faculty as the key gatekeepers for scientific engagement into seminary and theological education. The advantage they found for those who did engage it was like Asghar, who is a faculty and administrator at a Lutheran seminary, who said 100% of his students who participated in the course where he intentionally engaged science and hard sciences, more intentional, responded as a positive in one of his highest rating courses because they appreciated both the understanding of the critique, but they said it better prepared them to answer the questions of their congregation. And of some of the others that they were teaching for those that was doing undergraduate education. Gina admits that she was a bit surprised, and for her students it's also surprising, but in a positive way, of how then their suspicions and concerns around these life questions get addressed through the engagement of science in theological education. It was also noted that it was a little surprising to me that about 40% of the respondents who are now working in theological education, though, had science and technological backgrounds, which represented a large resource to where to begin the work. And where it could potentially go, and they identified that as such. They also found that creating a consortium across institution, because no one institution kind of felt they could maybe spearhead what scientific engagement and theological education could look like on their own, but some type of interinstitutional project would be helpful. as I stated at the beginning, the barriers was kind of the flip side, that some faculty, if they're the gatekeepers, their limited scientific knowledge and skills may then limit their willingness to bring it in. The lack of research agendas and low priority amongst the other competing demands and interests that many of our faculty leaders and administrators already have. So in conclusion, I'm down to my last minute, that if 90%, if that was 90% is accurate, and that is among the top 3 concerns, there's a need. There's also a rich landscape already present for how the process. There are some barriers that could impede, but there are also ways that are already implemented with our framework in which those can become more congruent with current priorities. And I will stop there, and then we can come back during discussion and question period. Thank you.
Great. Sybrina, thank you very much indeed. Can I say genuinely, first of all, I'm very honored and delighted to be here. I was invited originally by Hanan Alexander, and of course, as everybody here will know, unfortunately can't be with us. So that was one of the few people whom I knew who then couldn't be here. The other 2 people I thought I'd know in advance. One of them I'm glad to say is here, which is Rachel, who'll be speaking in a minute or two, because I find I now can't go to any conference about science religion without meeting Rachel. And the other person who was going to be talking in part of this session, Youssef, is somebody with whom I once edited a book but have never met. But he can't be here for health reasons. So it is really good, Rachel, to see you. And the few of you, the very few of you I've met, I've really appreciated the friendliness, and thanks to Lucinda in particular for the excellent way I've been looked after. My background originally was evolutionary biology and population genetics at PhD and postdoc level, and then I taught in schools for 5 years, so I now work mainly in science education, but I also happen to be an ordained minister in the Church of England, so I have a very gentle theological training. And because we don't have many people in the United Kingdom who are okay about evolutionary biology, know a bit about it, okay about science education, and have had some theological training, I've become the sort of obvious person in terms of issues to do with teaching creationism and intelligent design in the classroom, particularly because many of the other people who talk a bit about this and sometimes write tend to have extremely strong views and either are clear that we should never allow creationism and intelligent design to be discussed, or at the other extreme are desperate to get as much of it into the classroom as possible, whereas I tend to occupy a very sort of middle of the road position. Oh dear, I'm sorry. If you didn't hear any of that, it was a very long way of me saying, I'm glad to be here. Right. Okay. So this talk is an empirical talk, basically. It's about one particular project which is now finished, and it was about how to teach a particular way of looking at the relationship between science and religion in classrooms. The point of the intervention was to try to help students see, first of all, that biology is not always as reductionist as is often supposed, and secondly, to get them to think more about the fact that science and religion might be compatible. It was part of a project funded by Temple World Charities Foundation called The New Biology, and this is, of course, just a component to do with education. And we had designed RE, religious education lessons, and we had designed science lessons. 2 of my colleagues, Joe Pierce and Alexis Stones, designed the RE lessons. I designed the science lessons. And the 4th person, who's named at the front slide of this talk, Thamjid Mujtaba, is the person who did a lot of the data collection and helped with data analysis. So I'm just going to show you a little bit to give you an introduction to 2 of the religious education lessons. As many of you will know, England is unusual compared to many countries in the world, not only in permitting lessons in schools about religion, but insisting on them. Indeed, from 1944 until 1989, religion was the only subject that had to be taught in schools. We did bits of maths and English as well. And then in 1989, we got a national curriculum. and religious education continues to be a requirement, there's usually less time spent on it than most other subjects, though. So this is an example of the first lesson, which was about religion and science and getting students to think of them as being two windows for looking out onto the world. And we started with a particular quotation from somebody, Professor Freeman Dyson, who once won the Templeton Science Religion Prize. It's a very common metaphor, this. It goes back hundreds of years, possibly even longer. Science and religion are two windows that people look through, trying to understand the big universe outside, trying to understand why we are here. I'm just beginning to wonder if my intelligent presentation has got some default time setting on this wonderful laptop. So we'll see how the laptop and I get on together. Okay, students were then asked, this was one of the very few suggestions I made because it's a standard teaching technique I found very helpful, because often students, and we were dealing with 13 to 15-year-olds, they get quite tied up with the language. In fact, most adults get quite tied up with the language, so you can get them to do a drawing, just to okay. Just to represent science like a sort of circle or an ellipse or something in religion, and then to show the relationship between science and religion, and get them to talk about their diagram and what we can know and understand through science, if anything, and what we can know and understand through religion, if anything. So that was one lesson. Jumping ahead to lesson 3, the only other example I'm going to tell you about a religious education lesson, this is all to do about the soul, S-O-U-L. Now, I don't know how many of you know this wonderful experiment done by a bloke called McDougall, Duncan McDougall, in 1907. Just raise a hand if you know Dougal's experiment on weighing the soul. Yeah, actually, I thought there'd be some people here, but it's not everybody. This is too good to be true. So, McDougall thought, oh, crumbs, honestly, I'm coming to you in a minute. McDougall thought that when you died, your soul left you, and it probably weighed something. So how do you find out how much it weighs? Well, the obvious thing is you find people who are just about to die, and you weigh them when they're just about still alive, and then you weigh them when, very sadly, but conveniently for you, they've just died. So we had quite a lot of these people in 1907 because there's quite a lot of tuberculosis, and 4 of the 6 patients Dougal did this with were dying of tuberculosis, and that was very useful for him because I'm afraid when you're dying of tuberculosis, you're exhausted. So they could be, I'm not making any of this up, I promise you, they could be nice and steady on the big scales he had. Anyway, it didn't really work for various reasons, but one of the 6 people lost 21.3 grams in weight, just at the point when they died. There's a certain element of selective reporting going on here, because McDougall never produced the data on the other 5, but the one that died and lost 21 grams has sort of entered mythology, really. I could talk for far too long about McDougall, but let's get on to the fact that what we do with students is then they got a very brief sort of introduction to a range of thinking about the soul, including from standard religious traditions. And then what they had to do was to fill out a table. This is what we usually do in schools in England in lessons, get students to fill out tables. So they had to fill out a table that had a summary of the argument, whether the argument was in favor or against the existence of the soul, the evidence for the position the student held, why the evidence was credible, believable, strengths and weakness of the argument, and similar examples and or questions. The point was to get them to really start talking and thinking, what is the soul? Do I think the soul exists? What do I mean by the soul? If I do think the soul exists, is it a material object, like dear old McDougall thought, that weighs a certain amount, or is that completely the wrong way of looking at it? It's all about getting students to think about questions to do with epistemic literacy, with forms of knowledge and how they might be similar or different in different subjects, particularly religion and science. Okay, I'll tell you briefly, a little bit, only a tiny bit, about the biology lessons. The first one is exactly the sort of lesson you probably got in biology in school. This is because I tend to like to start off with teachers absolutely mainstream, get everybody comfortable. It's all about the fact that all of our cells in our body, apart from a few, but the vast, vast majority, have exactly the same genetic material. And yet, of course, the cells that make up our nerves and our skin and our bone look incredibly different. And school biology, some of you may have never thought of this before, most of you probably have, school biology doesn't do in most countries a very good job of getting students to think, well, why is it that I'm getting told these genes are really important for determining very subtle differences between people or between different species, and yet apparently the genes have got nothing to do with determining the difference between the various cells. Gently getting to think that biology may not be quite as reductionist as they'd thought. And then more of a sort of, by the time they got on to lesson 5, this is all about free will, and it's introduced through video clips about either the Truman Show or the Matrix. How many of you know the Matrix films? Who've raised a hand? They're pretty famous. That's probably 70% of us. Have any of you, do you know the Truman Show? Oh, great. That's a lot. Wow. The Truman Show. The Truman Show is just wonderful on a whole range of levels. But for getting 13 to 15-year-olds to start to think about issues to do with, well, how much do we control our lives? I won't give the whole story away about the Truman Show, but those of you who know it, and of course the Matrix is very well known, it is precisely about the nature of reality and our control over reality. Right, findings. So I'm really getting towards the core now, not much longer to go. We did interviews before and after the intervention with students, 40 in all, whom we interviewed the same ones before and after. 21 of the 40 changed their position about the relationship between science and religion. So of the ones who changed, 8 of them moved from a relationship of conflict, and I can, of course, send anybody the presentation who wants it, because I can see 1 or 2 people trying to take a picture of it. 8 of them changed from a position of conflict to one where they now saw science and religion asking the same question, but in different ways. 5 of them moved from conflict to the science and religion being compatible. 3, unlike McDougall, we do quote all our data, 3 moved in the other direction. Before the exercise, they saw science and religion as compatible. Afterwards, they thought they were in conflict. Oh dear. Well, 3 of them moved in different ways, and 2 of them moved in different ways. So, just to give you some examples, here's a quote of somebody who initially saw the position of conflict and now has moved to them answering the same question different ways. They have opposed styles, but then they have different things about them, and they have different beliefs about what the world is and what it's about. That's a pseudonym, Bilal, after the intervention. That's quite a sophisticated viewpoint that students reached after quite a small number of lessons. An example of 5 students who moved from conflict to compatibility. So this is Ali after the intervention, having previously been in the conflict situation, but after those interviews and the lessons, I started to think that maybe there's room for science. So Ali is somebody for whom religion previously had been the dominant way they understood the world. And here's Ranveer. Yes, I think science and religion have quite a lot in common because there's a cross-section between the belief and the evidence. Now, just Daryl Carson, who before the intervention said they both have theories and you really have to believe in both to actually get anywhere, believing in what they're doing is in common, so it's quite a balanced position. I don't know why, but afterwards Carson's saying people who believe in evolution can't believe in God, which is really not what the message of the intervention was meant to be about. Last slide, because this is I've only shown you a tiny subsection. Fascinatingly, a survey we conducted before the intervention found that the students who were more sure about the compatibility of science and religion were more positive about science and the contribution of science and the worth of science. They also scored higher on critical thinking skills, and they were more positive about their science lessons. The second bullet point is what I've just told you in the presentation, and the third bullet point was that although we didn't intend to change the teachers, actually the teachers quite often did change their points of view, which was quite interesting. Thank you very much indeed.
Moving that mic down. Okay. Thank you very much. It's really been an amazing experience being here for my first conference with everyone. Everyone has been so welcoming. I can't believe it. I keep telling everyone how amazing everyone is here. So thank you for that. I am going to explain this provocative illustration done by Carson, because I have met a lot of Carsons. That was his name, right? The one we just heard about from Michael in the introduction. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself as we go along. And then my colleague Anila and I are doing this presentation together. So Ari, just to complicate things for you, I thought I would talk for 5 minutes, Anila would do 10 minutes, and then I would do 5 minutes again. But it looks like we also have some flexibility, perhaps, so we'll see. Okay, so my name is Rachel. Even though I'm coming from the University of Haifa and I live in Jerusalem, I did grow up in the United States, as you might be able to tell. I speak English okay, yeah. And I grew up in a religious community, a Jewish community that saw no conflict between science and evolution. That was the definite message that was given over to me. And when I became an undergraduate and I wanted to study archaeology, I actually opted for prehistoric archaeology and paleoanthropology because I thought that might cause less friction with my religious story that I came with in, let's say, biblical archaeology or something like that, because evolution deals with the big universal questions that are out there. And I moved to Israel, a different part of the world. We're going to be talking about other countries right now in the Middle East in our presentation mostly. And I found a different sort of cultural impression out there. I found from both Jews and Muslims that I was encountering that there was a different view that basically if you accepted evolution, you were turning your back on religion or vice versa, and I encountered that in a lot of different ways. I was really curious about this, so I switched a little bit from my study of evolution to study religious responses to evolution. I did that in a science, technology, and society program, which really does focus on the contextualization of science and the humanizing of it, and I was doing that also with religion, but at the same time not taking away from the legitimacy or the integrity of either of those subjects, and really both trying to give them their due. So that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So just to give you some statistics, this is a study that was done a couple of years ago, a Pew study that showed really how polarizing the issue of evolution is currently in Israel. I would say the second headline, I would not have put it that way at all, because if you look at the categories in Jewish Israelis, Haredi is the Hebrew term. It could be translated as ultra-Orthodox. Dati would be just religious. I guess I would be in that category, and Masorati would be traditional, so people who respect religion. In fact, that's what I saw. You know, I walked into a classroom, my colleague invited me to come and talk about my subject. A man in the front row, he raised his hand. I couldn't even start my lecture. He said, "I'm not religious, but I am a Muslim and I respect religion, so obviously I don't even understand the title of this talk if it's about religion and evolution." And vice versa. My nephew had a friend come over. We were about to make kiddush at our table. I said, "Oh, do you do this in your family?" He said, "No, we do not do Shabbat, we believe in the Big Bang." So they're really accepting this sort of polarizing narrative of this is an identity issue. And something that's been really interesting throughout this conference is there are all sorts, in almost every session I've been in, there have been really strong reverberations and things that could really help me with my study. So I'm going to signal some of them, but hopefully you will think of others and bring them up in the conversation. But something kind of remarkable that I think will help us enter this conversation from a different perspective is the anthropologist who coined the term identity creationism, this linking of identity, of respecting their tradition with this idea of rejecting evolution. He was actually doing field work here on indigenous peoples, because he said people were saying, scientists are telling us you have stories about who you are and where you come from. Well, we're telling you that we have a different story, the true story of who you are and where you come from. And then Ronald Numbers, who is a historian of creationism, he used this term identity creationism that was coined in the context here to explain Jewish and other sort of anti-evolution sentiment. So I think that's something very important for us to keep in mind while we think about these issues. Just to tell you a little bit about what I found, I wound up writing my dissertation on the community I had grown up in, American Modern Orthodoxy, their responses to evolution over the 20th century. And really over the past 2 decades, there's been an accruing literature on the subject of other religions, other than Christianity, Jewish and Muslim and other religions' engagement with evolution. So there have been all sorts of interesting findings. I don't know if we're going to get into much of them, but I can tell you over the very general framework, when you could put your dissertation into one slide, wow, not even talk about the whole slide. But basically we saw in the earlier 20th century, I saw more conciliatory approaches to evolution being put forward by rabbis in America. And then all of a sudden, perhaps surprisingly, after mid-century, we saw actually anti-evolution sentiment often being put forward by religious scientists, actually. And I think some of that work, end of my 5 minutes. Okay, we saw anti-evolution, and then we saw a bit of a confusion and an ambivalence. I just want to point out I saw similar trends that were being pointed out in the Christian context and similar trends being pointed out in the Muslim context. So I saw this trend over the 20th century, perhaps what we would have thought or not would have thought, a more reconciliatory approach to evolution being replaced by a more antagonistic approach to evolution. And I think what's interesting here to look at is both the global trends and the local context in each of these identity creationisms. So this is a biology educator in Jordan who explains how her students have not encountered evolution very much, but they come in with a negative view of evolution, but she's very rapidly and easily able to turn them around within a semester or a year of education. She is coming forward with a woman of faith, presenting that Islam is actually not in conflict with evolution, and her students turn around. So on the one hand, it's a broad anti-evolutionism. I found it similar to what I was encountering with my students in Israel, but it's not necessarily deep, and the question is how to help students make that switch or to help them deal with these issues. The last point I just want to make before I turn this over to Anila is another way of phrasing what this woman was trying to do and other educators are working on is if there is something in the jargon called intelligent design and creationism in one camp and atheistic evolution on the other camp, they're both sort of saying that this category of theistic evolution, of a perspective that both wholeheartedly embraces the evolutionary perspective with religion, cannot exist. This is a way of people coming forward and say, well, I'm a theistic evolutionist and I want to have my voice be heard as well. And if you just want to, maybe we'll talk about even a little bit later of these differences of what did these terms mean, how is it used in the discourse. Theistic evolution, as I said, it's accepting both, whereas intelligent design is really trying to say that my religion and my science is interacting in a certain, maybe this is a derogatory term, they call it a God of the gap sort of a method. So I'm going to pick up after Anila in terms of talking about what are some of the interventions that we're working on right now on this issue. So I'm just going to get your slideshow up.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for having me here. This is my first time attending this conference, and believe me, I've enjoyed, every minute of my conversations and interactions, with my colleagues here. My name is Anila Asghar, and I work at McGill University. I've been looking at the responses to evolution in Muslim communities. I grew up in Pakistan. I am Muslim, and I studied evolution and never encountered any opposition to evolution, and naively thought that Muslims don't tend to have any problems with evolution. But when I started doing this research as part of my postdoctoral research project, I found many interesting results, which I'm going to share with you very briefly. So evolutionary theory is very important, in science education, in science and in biology, because it tends to unify, it provides a unifying framework, to integrate different, areas within biology and other related disciplines also. Okay, so recent studies indicate a widespread rejection of evolution among students. Muslim science teachers and scientists' positions on evolution are, based on a number of contextual factors, which I'm going to illuminate, their beliefs determine how they enact the science curriculum in their classrooms. For some reason, I cannot see it on the. Okay, that's good. Okay, all righty. So We also found, through our review of the literature and our empirical studies, that a nation's educational, religious, and political contexts are intimately linked to teachers, physicians, and students' perceptions and understanding and acceptance of evolution in different continents. So the purpose of our research was to explore the intersections among religion, science, and education in Muslim communities, including Muslim communities in Canada. We conducted this research, as I said, with Muslim communities. All right. So this is a comparison of the perceptions about human evolution, from different countries. So there was a study that was conducted back in 2006 by Miller and colleagues, and they asked people in different countries in Europe, including Turkey and North America, and their development from earlier species of animals. And you see some opposition to it. And in Turkey you see that about 40% were opposed to this idea, more than 40%. We used the same question, and then we asked students from Pakistan, Lebanon, Egypt, Indonesia, and Turkey about the same question, and you can see some variation in the responses, but a widespread disagreement to this idea in Turkish students and Indonesian students, Pakistani, Lebanese, and Egyptian students also tended to disagree with it, but there was some agreement as well. Okay, I also wanted to share with you the position of scientific academies of some Muslim countries. So the Scientific Academy of Research and Technology in Egypt, Academy of Sciences of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then Pakistani Science Academy, Palestine Academy for Science and Technology, as well as the Uganda National Academy of Science, have endorsed a statement about evolution. And they've also endorsed the teaching of evolution. Now, the academies of sciences tend to be very powerful bodies, right? Fortunately or unfortunately. But, but it is important to note that scientists, who are members of these academies from these 5 or 6 countries have endorsed a statement that supports evolution and teaching of evolution. And this statement was developed by the Inter-Academy panel on the teaching of evolution. These scientists agree that the theory of the evolution of galaxies, stars, planets, and of life on Earth over billions of years is supported by observations and experiments from all branches of the natural sciences. It's a very clear, concrete statement that they have endorsed. So one would just think that, if scientists have endorsed it, some scientists have endorsed it, then students and teachers might also, have no objections to evolution. But since 1859, when I started looking at the literature, I learned that since 1859, Muslim intellectuals have responded to evolution in various ways. They've rejected it or accepted it or selectively accepted it, by reconciling some components of the evolutionary theory to their religious beliefs. And this is based on multiple and often conflicting interpretations of the Quranic view of creation. I'll just share with you quickly some examples. Islamic creationists argue that evolution contradicts the religious view of creation, whereas secularists endorse the integration of biological evolution with modern science. The narrative that we found among most of the Muslims, we did not find a controversy around the concept of time involved in evolution, and it is because of the fluidity of this concept and its interpretation in the scripture. One day has been identified as 1,000 years of what you count, or as a day the measure of which is 50,000 years in the Quran. So young earth creationism is not it does not exist, in the discourses that we have looked at in Muslim communities. So as I shared earlier, the purpose of our study was to explore how Muslim scientists, teachers, and students construe biological evolution and what is the treatment of evolution in science curricula. I'll focus, mostly on our work with scientists and teachers. So I'm just giving you a glimpse of the interrelationships that exist between science and religion in science curricula from different Muslim countries. So we do not tend to have this demarcation or separation between science and religion. So in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the curriculum says that science learning goals advocate the study of nature as an act of religious devotion. In Oman and Saudi Arabia, the purpose of learning science through scientific observation is to strengthen students' Islamic beliefs about Allah, Allah's creation. And know God, the great creator, for the existence of the created is evidence that the great creator exists. So in some ways, studying science also becomes an act of devotion, religious devotion, where you are discovering the natural world that has been written by the Creator. Okay, so again, the goal of biology education in Pakistan is to enable the students to appreciate that Allah is the creator and sustainer of the universe. This we haven't found in any other country, but only in the textbooks in Pakistan. When I was growing up, other textbooks were used, but then, I went back to my country. I, looked at the biology textbooks, and I found, Quranic verses also in biology textbooks. So there's a chapter or separate section on origin of life, which talks about the Islamic view of creation and development of human beings as well as other living beings. So here, it's not very clear, but you can see the Quranic verses and their translation also. So very quickly, I'll just share with you three themes that we noticed in these textbooks. The universe and all living beings are created by Allah. And then these are the Quranic verses. Okay? All living beings have been created from water, and humans were created from clay. And they have included the relevant verses from the Quran and in relation to these themes. So I'll just share with you an interpretation which was given in one of the biology textbooks to look at the scientists' interpretation of this. So the scientists who wrote the textbooks, that is how they interpreted the scripture. A close study of above sermons reveals that all animals had common origin, but they gradually underwent changes afterwards and became different from each other. It seemed that animals of today are advanced forms of the past animals who achieved this form after passing through many changes. So it is, hinting at the idea of the concept of common origin. So I'll share with you a few examples of, the ideas that were shared with us by Muslim scientists from Pakistan and Lebanon. So Allah says, kun fayakun, be and it happens. The Quran says that Allah created everything in 6 days, but the length and duration of these days is not defined. And according to this scientist, radiocarbon dating provides physical evidence in favor of Darwin's concept. But then there was another Pakistani scientist, a marine biologist, and she was opposed to evolution. According to her, Quran is the word of God. There is no compatibility between the religious and scientific view of creation. God created Adam first, not as a Neanderthal. And she did not accept human evolution. Muslim teachers' views. So the Islamic view of human creation is that humans were created by Allah with water and clay as it is in their present form, physical structure and form, according to that teacher. I will also share with you, some of the ideas that were shared with us by Canadian Muslim teachers, and they teach in Islamic schools here in different provinces. So according to a high school science teacher, evolution means the survival of the fittest. I have no problem with it. I cannot believe that man came from ape. all the creation is from Allah, and Allah created Adam with clay. So human evolution seems to be a huge issue, in Muslim communities worldwide. And according to this female anthropology teacher in a Canadian school, in public schools, religion is not allowed. In a religious school, it is different. Islam would be in science classes. There is freedom to include Islam in every subject and look at things from the religious perspective. So they teach the curriculum that is mandated by the ministry, by the ministries of their provinces, but then they also feel that they have the freedom to include religious perspectives also, right, while teaching different subjects. Okay, so going back to what Muslim teachers said, all agreed that there is no contradiction between science and Islam. So they don't see, a divide or conflict between science and Islam in general. They want to explore the world, to understand it scientifically, to use the aql or reason that God gave us. But when it comes to evolution, people did express their opposition to either the entire evolutionary theory or human evolution. So in a nutshell, Muslim scientists generally did not see any major conflict between Islam and science. Some scientists or biologists try to reconcile evolution with religion, because if they are working with evolutionary theory as an organizing principle, I felt that they had to find a common ground. They had to seek, compatibility between the two realms. Whereas scientists from other fields, such as chemistry or atmospheric science or chemical engineering, either, initially in our initial conversations, either they had some negative perceptions, negative views of evolution, but, through further conversation, we found out that in general, they did not have any issues with the evolution of living beings, but it's human evolution that poses problems. In the same way, Muslim teachers also, had issues with human evolution. We also found that the majority of the science teachers did not exhibit a clear and in-depth understanding of evolutionary science. And similarly, scientists from, other than biologists, also, scientists from other fields, physics, chemistry, engineering, atmospheric sciences, also did not have a nuanced and a deeper understanding of evolutionary theory. And so I should be, I'll be very quick with this. So students, although I haven't presented any data from students, but we found that students also exhibited a weak and inconsistent understanding of evolution, and their religious beliefs considerably influenced their perceptions of evolution. So in most of the country's school curricula, including science education curricula, are used as vehicles for nation building, used as vehicles to build a Muslim identity. And how and what teachers teach about evolution is more important than what is in the curriculum, because some teachers told us that even though evolution is included in the textbooks, right? It is a part of the secondary science school curriculum, and most of the teachers who we interviewed said that they tend to teach it because they want the students to learn the concept in order to pass their exams. But some of them also tell their students that it's not true, it's not correct according to Islam. So they do interject their own perceptions of evolution while teaching the science of evolution. I'll stop here and then, turn it over to Rachel to share with us some strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just say Anila and I met in Germany this summer, where we were invited to give a workshop for students in the Islamic theology department, an Islamic theology department on the topic, and they told us 16 students were going to come, and in the end, 80 students were trying to cram in. So it seemed to us that the students were really interested. Let's see, how do I get this? There we go. Okay, great. So, so I just wanted to clarify, it wasn't clear when I was rushing off, that basically this perspective was just saying that evolution is not an outlier. These are complicated theological questions. No one understands how natural, or maybe if you do,
both exist in the world. But the point is to say that evolution is not the only place where this is a question that we don't understand the issue. So we have 2 projects that I'm specifically involved in, maybe a few more in Israel right now going on the subject. One's gone on for the past 5 years, so I'll touch on that. The one that's just starting this month that Michael's also involved in, I won't talk about all that much. Maybe next time I'll come and talk about that one. But basically what we've been doing is presenting 3 rabbinic views on evolution. I'm going to skip all this stuff from the pilot project right now just because I see I'm kind of out of time. So I'm just going to, maybe we'll get back to it in the conversation if you'd like. So we present 2 rabbinic perspectives that are embrace evolution from different theological views, even though these are all Orthodox rabbis. This is done in the religious school stream. And the 3rd rabbi who has an anti-evolution perspective. And lots of questions have arisen when we're giving these 3 rabbinic perspectives. The first question is, okay, if you are coming from a perspective where you accept evolution, why are you standing up and presenting next to a person who's presenting an anti-evolution perspective? And there are multiple answers to that. But if we've already said, for example, that the global trend out there is that most of the students have only heard or mostly heard the anti-evolution perspective, and then you're not including that in your presentation, you're not really coming out as very respectable or reliable if you're presenting Jewish views on evolution and you're only presenting pro-evolution perspectives. But what it does do is if they hear that there are different views, teachers have reported back to us that it's helped their students move from understanding what the view is to, okay, the views in Judaism. But then teachers are saying they're having a hard time getting them to that next stage of saying, okay, there are lots of views on the subject, and sometimes while we are seeing that as a positive element, teachers say students sometimes take that in a negative side of saying lots of people say lots of things and anyone could just say whatever they want. This was an issue we've already talked about. I like chocolate, you like vanilla. Is that how we're addressing this issue of what is the perspective that you identify most? And the teachers can get to that multiplist perspective, but then bringing in the evaluative stage of saying, well, we want to address that in a different way in the debrief. That's some of the things that we're really trying to work on for the next stage of the project. Am I out of time or? Kind of out of time. I'll just show you that the next intervention that we're working on in the new project is actually related to the sheets that everyone spoke about in the beginning of this session. And here are some of the other questions that we put on that exercise. And the last slide I actually had prepared were questions of open-ended questions. Since this conference has been a lot about questions, and in general I like questions, these are just questions that we've posed to Muslim colleagues. Is this rabbinic session that's been going on for the past 5 years, is this something that seems relevant to do with students from other traditions, with specific texts? Are other formats seem more relevant to your students? And something that actually related to a topic that came up also on a past session where Sybrina was talking about, we've really seen the relevance of who is presenting the material. I'm coming in not as an insider necessarily in the Israeli scene. I walk in with 2 Israeli rabbis who bring a lot of social capital with them to the scene, and we've seen that also in the Muslim context and other contexts as well. So it's also the information, also who's presenting it, and the relationship, and lots of other factors that are going into this process. So I'd love to talk about it with everybody.
Thanks to all of our presenters. We have, according to the schedule, a little bit less than a half an hour for Q&A. So, any Qs?
Thanks. Thank you guys very much. That was really super informative and thought-provoking. I have a question about the bringing up the 2 rabbis, or several rabbis, right? So, that's kind of a rabbinic way of doing things, right? Yeah. Rabbi A said this, Rabbi B said that. I wonder if, why even have that conversation, right? Because the point of the conversation does not seem to be in the Talmud that you can just think whatever you want. There's an end goal to the conversation. Is that something that would resonate with the students? Like, oh, you can't just think whatever you want. We're actually going somewhere with this conversation.
I would contest that. In the Talmud, we preserve every opinion because we say every opinion has value, even if it's not the way we practice. There's value to that opinion, and there's something to be learned from that. So one of the questions that I've been living my life, and every time I have to hear this anti-evolution perspective, and my blood is boiling, like, what am I learning from that? Like, can I take that into my own life, and is that a value we want to pass on to our students? So I still think it's a more complex question than that. It's the evaluation is still complicated for them. And the question is, maybe religiously it might be valid to say, okay, anti-evolution is a religious perspective, but then we're bringing in science, which is a different discipline, to then say, okay, well, even if pro and anti-evolution perspectives might exist and live side by side from a religious, disciplinary, epistemic perspective, but then we have this other thing called science, and then that's weighing in on the religious debate as well. So teachers are having a hard time with it.
Thank you.
So thank you for these papers. They're really interesting. I work in the kind of politics of religion education, and I'm wondering if you could comment. So I'm interested in context, like what's the context in which these discussions go on? So Anila, your comment about education as nation building, it was just a kind of an offhand. To me, that's an important issue. And I'm wondering, so states, governments tend not to be that interested in critical thought. What they want is a certain kind of social order. And I'm wondering what the implications of state intervention is in defining the context or the limits on the kind of thinking that can go on, the kind of questions, the kind of diversity, epistemological diversity, and that sort of thing. So the role of the state in delivering public education, for example.
Thank you. So thank you for this question. I think through this work we've learned that yes, the state uses public education or education in general to promote their sense of identity that Muslim students should develop. So first of all, foremost, it is important, considered important for students to understand that science and Islam are compatible, and that the study of science in itself could be interpreted as an act of religious devotion, right? Yes, critical thinking is encouraged. Inquiry-based science is also encouraged, but it depends on the views that teachers bring to the classroom. That basically determines, that shapes the curriculum. Scientists do tend to echo the state's goals regarding science education. The fact that the scientific academies of so many countries have endorsed evolution shows that at least at that level, in theory, in principle, they do not seem to have an issue with evolution. They have included in Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Lebanon, Indonesia, sorry, and Egypt, evolution is included, biological evolution is included in science curricula, which again shows that the state does not oppose the inclusion of evolution. But then human evolution is implicitly implied in the Pakistani textbooks, biology textbooks, but thank you. But in other, textbooks such as, the textbooks that are being used in Indonesia or Turkey, we did not see any explicit reference to human evolution. Yes. So, and then again, your cultural context and the context of communities play a very important role in shaping the discourse on evolution in classrooms. So even if the state endorses it, if teachers are opposed to evolution, they would tell the students that, you can superficially, study this topic to pass your exams, but you do not have to accept this idea. Thank you.
Yeah, also thank you very much for very engaging presentations. I liked Leo's question quite a lot and would be quite interested to hear Michael respond to that.
Well, that's very gracious of you. Thank you. So the United Kingdom, and England in particular, as many of you will know, is a country where very roughly the power of religion in the political sphere has been diminishing over the decades, but that has been less the case the last 15 years or so, to the surprise of many policymakers and those in government. You don't tend to get people on the streets protesting about things like evolution and how it should be taught in schools. But it is interesting that the present government, which is usually characterized as being a fairly right-wing government, a conservative government, has been very positive about insisting on equality in the sphere of sexualities in schools, and has been surprised by the fact that not insignificant numbers of Muslim parents of children in primary schools in England are not comfortable with their children being told that homosexuality is as acceptable as heterosexuality. And I think a little bit more thought and advance from people who know a little bit about dealing with controversy and differences of opinion might have been able to prevent some of what we've got, which is a very standard government response where initially it tells minorities they don't know what they're talking about, then it tells them that they're wrong, then it fails to back up the majority position because it realizes the minorities are quite articulate and are not going away. So everybody ends up getting unhappy with the government, which is a very conventional English way of dealing with difficulties.
Thank you. I add my thanks to everyone else's for your helpful and thoughtful presentations. I am wondering about other issues in science that might be used to test drive this relationship. We certainly hear evolution as the kind of exhibit A. I think about things like the nature and meaning of artificial intelligence in relation to human personhood. But are there others, and are you all engaged in conversations about these others? Thank you.
So in the study we didn't focus on an area of science, and we did find, kind of how I point out, that creationists and environmentalism comes in, but there are also the medical and hard sciences come in when you start thinking of things of genome, right, that still associate for many religious educators and theological educators around the idea of care for life, right, but in our current era, that having to be dealt with. The same thing with how we process information and all of that. So it was more than one lens of how it was being incorporated. The issue, though, was consistent, was either under that care of life framework, even if we're thinking about various sciences, even if we move beyond evolution, it still had an attachment to that. And then the second one was that the faculty or the instructor was the gatekeeper. So I think in both of these studies, it talks about how regardless of what curriculum or which texts get incorporated or how it is applied, very much lies to that faculty and instructor. And so what their skill and knowledge range is. So we had a few, you could maybe from the examples I use, Henrietta was more of a technologist and engineer than a scientist. And so in her room, yes, stuff like artificial intelligence, imagery, and things like that comes to play in how she deals with various courses. But as long as that's the main gatekeeper and they're in isolation, so that's why the idea of when they were asked about solutions, some type of consortium of things like that comes out, because it then moves beyond that limitation of what happens at an individual seminary and what level of expertise or who you have access to bring in to broaden the expertise, because everybody probably can't afford to bring Michael in, and he can't be in all those places at one time. So those were some of the things that came up.
Can I just make one comment about the artificial intelligence robotics? So I think these are wonderful issues to discuss with students in schools because they're quite open-ended, which is one of the attractions of talking about them, because as you imply, some of the fairly well-known issues, the positions are reasonably clear. Not necessarily the conclusion, not what people should think, but the alternative positions, and that's much less so. So just for a second, just to destroy any credibility with most of you that I may have built up, I belong to the minority position that sees personhood as an emergent property. We grow into it as we develop as individuals. That's not incredibly rare as a position, as most people know, but the next bit I think is much rarer. I think it absolutely possible that in the lifetime of the students in standard K-12 education, things that we presently call AI, software, robots, will develop the cognitive capacities that mean that in any useful sense, they themselves are developing moral awareness, sensitivity towards emotions, to others, asking questions about meaning themselves that are exactly that we would consider constitutive of the manifestation of personhood in teenagers, when it goes well with teenagers. And I think that's going to have profound implications for how we deal with robots, and will raise all sorts of questions. So this is a very, very good time in science, STEM subjects, computing, to be thinking about all these issues.
I was just going to say one last thing, which I like the example not only of artificial intelligence, but also free will that Michael mentioned, because that's an issue that's relevant to people who also don't identify with formal religion. That's a philosophical question that's related to the sciences. So that's a lot of other students that we didn't really talk about as much here, as opposed to a knee-jerk question like climate change or these ones that have become traditionally politicized. I think it's really important, and I thought the questions that the students you talked about were mentioning, I thought that was amazing to hear them.
Thank you very much for all your insights. My question and concern is whether we are actually limiting our discussions. We talk about religion and science. Religion is a vast field, many different views and opinions, many different perspectives. Science also has a lot of varieties of views and opinions. Many of my students say, I don't believe in religion, I believe in science. And I say, well, that's a very interesting question. And I'm wondering whether we, or maybe I ask this as a question, do you at all in your teachings, in your research, in your discussions and conversations, make the distinction between science as a human activity, using the empirical method to come up with numerous discoveries, and scientism as a worldview, and whether that needs to be entered into the equation, because scientism as a worldview is considerably different than the worldviews of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so forth.
I would say the only way it kind of came up a little bit in the conversation of the data we were doing with the interviews of these industry, institutional leaders and things, was that it was framed with students where they got the positive student responses, was students being able to even explore the question. Right, so when they were invited to look at multiple worldviews rather than starting, I think someone argued earlier, it's not just open, we already have an end in mind. Students actually didn't enjoy that as much or respond as well to that. What they responded to was being exposed, as Rachel said, to the multiple worldviews, being shown that it was, whether it was scientism, as you're calling it, or whatever theological framework, and even multiple interreligious worldview frameworks, being exposed to that around whatever common problem, question, or issue, and then allowed to come to their various resolves. Because most of them weren't okay either with we just leave it open and everybody can believe whatever. Like, they worked very diligent, one of the faculty talked about, of coming to some place, but it just broadened, being exposed to that broadening and having permission of that different worldviews, they found invigorating and helpful, not only in the work they did in particular courses, et cetera, but even in dialogue. And this study was really around people who teach at seminary. So they were thinking of those who were going out in some form of the world to then take various leadership roles around these conversations. So they found the broadness, actually, rather than trying to figure out which one and how we get them to a path, that student responses were more favorable when that was the case.
And the only thing I'd say is that, first of all, I remember when I used to teach biology to students and we went into a local wood, I would always start off by saying to them, look, there are lots of ways of understanding this wood. You could do it as a geographer, as a historian, as an artist, in drama. We're going to do quadrats. We're scientists. Trying to make it clear that today our lens was just that particular lens. But the bigger question you ask, in our national curriculum, we try and have a bit about the nature of science, so that the distinction you drew between scientism and the methodologies or the methods of science is one that should be there. Now, it's not taught very well, mainly because most science teachers have never had even a basic grounding in philosophy of science, and so they're not as comfortable teaching it as they are teaching Newton's laws, which they tend to be quite good at. But it is there, and it does give the opportunity for lots of funded research projects, such as the sorts of ones people have been talking about, to try and work with teachers and do more continuing professional development. And the nice thing is, we usually find that the large majority of students quite enjoy having a bit of such consideration.
Well, I would just add that I let Anila also jump in if you wanted, but I think maybe I didn't clarify this enough, but there was a lot of debate that we founded on where that line is between science and its interpretation. What are the facts and what are the metaphysics? And people have different views on what's a legitimate extension or, you know, necessary implication of science versus what isn't. And that line, which you were sort of saying, scientism is the illegitimate extension of science beyond its purview, and what is that purview, and what is religion allowed to talk about when science is, it's not as much of a consensus. There's lots of debates on those different issues. So I think that's certainly one of the hugest, most complicating factors involved here. And then, you know, so lots of people who accept both science and religion do it in all sorts of permutations in different ways along those lines.
So to build on that, just very briefly, that is why developing a deeper understanding of the nature of science or scientific epistemology is, you know, a key goal of scientific literacy globally. You know, students need to understand the different epistemologies, the different epistemological frameworks that are used, you know, in religion or in science, and then they can compare and coordinate them to develop their own worldviews.
Yeah. Thank you. Really interesting, fabulous, fabulous work. I was struck by the remarks that in regard to the Islamic students and teachers about the comfort with evolution until we get to human beings, and it connected to the notion of environmental stewardship. And one of the things that I'm wondering about in the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be human, and for example, our responsibility to the other creatures, to creation more generally, those are actually bridge questions. It would seem to me that these are bridge questions in it, whether or not you believe in climate change or understand it. When we see fires burning all over the place, and people dying, and also species dying out. So I'm wondering about how we address, let's say we say, well, human evolution, we don't want to go there. But what do we say about our responsibilities as human beings to creation and to the creator, even if you want to ask it in a religious way? And so that's, I'm kind of just thinking out loud off the top of my whatever.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful question. According to my understanding, you know, Muslim theologians as well as, general, people in different communities do see themselves as stewards, and they see that it as their responsibility to protect and sustain and conserve nature, because the book of nature, they look at two books, the Quran, the book of the Word of God, and nature is also the book of God. And then they believe that it's their religious obligation to study it, understand it, and then also act in a responsible manner.
I think that's a really interesting point also that highlights the role of clergy in all of this, because associations of scientific associations and science teachers can say one thing, but if you are not having clergy members involved in the process as well in the partnership, that really hampers the process. I could just give one example from the Jewish context. You have a quote in your folder I saw from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and he not too long ago wrote a chapter that was talking about the spiritual lessons that could be learned from evolution, including human evolution. So that kind of a dialogue where clergy is getting involved, I think is an essential element of all of this from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think the only thing to build off that is that that last point is critical, because when they talked about the knowledge gap, and I said if 40% of the pool came from these scientific and technological backgrounds, the religious questions had happened for them in that context. So in other words, those scholars are going to have the conversation from their perspective. My institution, Georgia Institute of Technology, does not have a religious studies department at all. We offer 4 different areas between human-centered and computing, my area, and that deals, though, with religious studies around ethics and hopes and all of that in their scientific work, right? So they're doing it. If it's closed off, that's what I think some of those informants were concerned about. But when they get to the seminary setting, in the case of the study that I presented, if it's closed off then from the theological perspective sides, but those students are still being informed, right? That's why they said they noticed their students, if you remember one of the quotes, are theologically, but technologically and scientifically informed, right? Then that gap that exists in those rooms becomes a little bit of a problem of then that argument around stewardship from that perspective. If it doesn't engage some of the science and those other technological perspectives that they're informed with, they're finding a conflict there that I don't think that creates opportunity. And we'll keep it that way, creates opportunity of where we go with that.
Time for 2 more questions.
Okay. I have a question, but I just want to remark on what you said, that from the evolutionary perspective, it is actually redundant whether there is a catastrophe or not. There were previous catastrophes, if the world, the theories of decimation and so on. So it's actually a religious or ideological perspective whether we want to preserve nature. But what I wanted to ask was about what for me was a seeming contradiction even within your discourse. On the one hand, you are adopting this essentially multiplist approach, the 2 windows approach, so to say, and it's like choosing your own window, and in essence, you could just say, well, I choose to never open the window of science or not. And on the other hand, especially Rachel was very explicit about using an epistemological approach and using the explicit terms, absolutist and multiplist and evaluative, which come from Kuhn's work and were further developed in Chin and in Sarit Barzilai's work, which actually say there is a better way to explain and that scientific arguments can be won in a sense. And in this sense, evolution should come with the upper hand. So is this a strategic doublespeak, or is it a deep, ongoing 2 languages which you share?
I mean, I think I'll start because it's simply that in England, most students at this age range, I'm afraid 13 to 15, haven't had much opportunity to think about these things in school lessons. So you're right, ours in a way is just a very gentle getting people to begin to think in this area. But I'm quite keen on learning progressions, and ultimately one would have wanted that to have happened at an earlier stage, so that by the time we get to the mandatory end of school leaving age, 16, they've developed a rather richer understanding of some of these issues.
Well, I think you also picked up on my own sort of ambivalences that I was throwing out there and saying that I am an activist, that I am presenting a certain perspective, and I'm also being very overt and obvious in stating that this is my activist perspective and my understanding of the science and the religion, and sort of asking, is that valid? And saying, how open and pluralistic am I being? How much am I really being totally open to the dialogue and the diversity while still holding true to my perspective, if I am also talking and having the other perspective voiced and claiming that mine is the evaluative perspective that should win for certain reasons. So I think that I'm really glad you asked that, and that was really, I think, one of the things I was sort of hinting at, if I didn't say it overtly in my presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, all of your presentations. I'm coming here. Were really wonderful and rich and provide a lot of stimulation for thought. I'm curious about the question I was raised earlier about methodologies, and whether in the seminary program specifically you saw teachers and educators engaging with the questions around epistemology. So how do we come to know, how do the methods of science understand the process of knowing? What is our theological perspective around the process of knowing? And even maybe incorporating that into a methodologies course around different modes of research. So that was my first question. A kind of follow-up question around process, which you highlighted as really important and critical for engaging these two topics, was whether you saw teachers team teaching across disciplines. So within a university context, a neuroscience professor getting together with a religious educator to talk and teach together in a dialogical fashion around the intersections.
So to answer the first question, well, actually, I'll answer the second one first because it's easier. So you notice on the slide, I was trying to go a little fast around there, but when I got to around how was it being integrated, that blended modern, it was a line up there that said blended modern sources. That's exactly what it was. So when a guest lecturer comes, most of the time it's not lending over their classroom and letting the guest lecture. It was the co-teaching model because, they understood that if they were bringing a scientific expert in and they're being the theological expert on that, the dialogical model kind of helps to say, where both of them recognizing their bias more than likely would bring that into conversation. So the co-teaching. And the other way that they saw that, if you recall, I did a quote of those who took then the students out, that field trip model was a way of moving beyond process, the normal traditional process into saying, how can we be more innovative in bringing these two communities together? And it can't be always, do we invite science in through just referencing and citing sources, et cetera, but no, how do we go out into scientific spaces with our theological questions and finding cohorts within that community that welcome? So those were two ways that blended model, the process kind of moving in those spaces. To the first questions around methods and things like that, if you notice when I was reading the data, especially some of the qualitative data in there, that's where most the bigger critique came of those who felt like they were doing this work even amongst their colleagues, and they were like, what they call integrating of science didn't really match what they felt was a scientific methodology or even a higher order inquiry level around epistemology. It was more so how I use this to support this facts or already claims. And so that was one of the areas of bigger critique that is really not happening as much by that. But they feel that a lot of people don't know how, right? So even Henrietta, when she got to digital technology, she was pointing out that a lot of that is, oh yeah, we use technology in the class, and that was to her much different than the theoretical framework and the epistemology around digital technology, AI, et cetera, and what that means on development and identity and all of that. And so that was one of the bigger areas of critique, that no, it's not really there. And creating that methodology type of course takes skill that many of them felt was missing in this process.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for the formal conversation, but I obviously encourage the conversations to continue. Thanks so much to the panelists. Have a great day.